as we mentioned, we did a brief overview last week of what we're going to be covering over the 3-week period of these talks. Last week we did what's called natural apologetics, which was noted on your worksheet that some of you don't have because I didn't bring them. Natural apologetics, demonstrating the existence of God. So that was the intended conclusion of last week, that we prove merely by force of our reason and by observations we make in nature, not on the level of the supernatural, not dealing with divine revelation, but we prove with our reason, looking at nature, that God certainly exists. Now, we could do all 3 weeks on that question. The arguments presented have so much to them that it's impossible to get through, to do them justice in the amount of time we're given. But I gave you the structure of each of the arguments, which then you can kind of continue on and check out for your own. I brought a couple books that are of really great value in the whole process of apologetics, the whole 3 steps. I'd recommend in particular this one here. It's called Apologetics and Catholic Doctrine. It's by Archbishop Michael Sheehan. And just because I want to say this, the person who edited it was a priest from a diocese in Australia named the Diocese of Wagga Wagga. Okay? Just kind of wanted to say that. And so this starts from what we did last week, proofs for the existence of God, does what we're doing tonight, does what we're doing next week, basically proving that the Gospels are reliable historical documents, and then the next week proving that Jesus founded the Catholic Church as the one church. And then it starts from there, after having finished apologetics, it then starts the whole outline of all of Catholic doctrine. So from beginning to end, everything is in this book in really clear language with helpful diagrams. One of the diagrams that you have, the big chart with manuscripts, is taken from this book. It lays out things in that kind of clarity. So I'd really highly recommend this book. This book also, Apologetics, follows the same classical process of apologetics. It's by Father Anthony Alexander, just called College Apologetics. Excellent book. Classical Apologetics.
What was his last name?
Alexander, Father Anthony Alexander. Okay, so tonight we start Christian apologetics after having finished natural apologetics. So establishing the historical evidence for that intervention of God, that revelation of God in history that we were led to expect with overwhelming probability after we prove that He exists, and that it's likely that He reveal Himself because of His goodness, His infinite power, His goodwill towards us and creating us out of merely His will. So, Christian apologetics, the artwork here, by the way, is kind of contrary to my plan, because it shows an angel dictating the Gospels to one of the evangelists. But of course, during this process of apologetics, we're talking about the Gospels not as inspired documents, but merely as historical data, as historical documents, and we're testing them on those criteria and those alone. But it's still a nice piece of art that I like to add in there. Now, to summarize some of the things we said last week, atheism is the belief that there was nothing and nothing happened to nothing, and then nothing magically exploded for no reason, creating everything, and then a bunch of everything magically rearranged itself for no reason whatsoever into self-replicating bits, which then turn into dinosaurs. Makes perfect sense. A little snarky thing I put in there, but the reason I put it in is because we talked about, towards the end of last talk, about Dr. Lawrence Krauss and how he redefined the word nothing to in fact mean something, so that he could say something can come from nothing. He said that to avoid having to take into account a first cause, that there needed to be a cause, otherwise how could something come into being from nothing? His claim was something can come from nothing, and by nothing he meant something. So that sounds convoluted. If that sounds convoluted, it is. It's ridiculous. And that's why this kind of snarky phrase is put that way, because there is some truth to it in the sense that it does sound ridiculous if you try and dodge a first cause. It sounds silly, but anyway. And that's on Access Vision, so people all throughout Battle Creek can see that. I'll get a lot of messages. Okay. So where we left off, as I said, having demonstrated God's existence through a number of different proofs, in addition to being the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, and the intelligent being, He is immaterial, that is spiritual, good, infinite, eternal, and personal. With that last one, personal, we mean has an intellect and a will. We know that He didn't have to create, since He was perfect. We prove that by a reason that He's a perfect being, the greatest of all conceivable being. Okay, Since he was that, he had no need of finite creation, and so the only conclusion is that God created out of his will. Therefore, we know that because he's an intelligent being and has a will, that he is personal, and in that sense we are made in his image with intellect and will. So that's why we said it is overwhelmingly probable that he would at some point reveal himself to his rational creatures. Okay? That he is benevolent. That is something we can come to through our reason. That he is not only exists, is all powerful, but he is all good and has goodwill towards us, and made us such that we can come to know him with our minds. So then it makes sense that that is part of his desire, his will, to be known by his creatures. Okay? Giving us the equipment to do so. That's the point. Okay, now, what's our next thing? Our task is to investigate the reliability, the integrity, and the authenticity of texts which claim to be that self-revelation of God, namely the four Gospels. So given that it's overwhelmingly probable that God would at some point reveal himself in history, we then look at those credible claims to that revelation. And we end up with, maybe as a starting point, the four Gospels. There's a number of reasons why we choose the four Gospels as opposed to anything else, but it's primarily based on their own claim of being historical documents, not mythological creations to explain things, or nice stories, or symbolic representations of virtues, or anything like that. But the claim is that these are historical documents that record something really epic happening in history, namely that God became part of history, became visible, audible, someone we could see and touch and hear and learn from, that he came to tell us who he was and that what we needed to do to be saved. That's why we take the four Gospels. Again, not because we're starting with any idea that they are inspired, not starting with any idea that they're inerrant, anything like that. Just that they seem to be important historical documents. That's what they claim to be. And that manuscript there, in the break, we could have Mr. Smith read it for everyone, if if you want, So I just said this. Don't think of the Gospels right now as anything other than historical texts. The reason I keep harping on that, and the whole harping on reason alone, is because, again, in order to make the case for your faith, remember 1 Peter 3:15, that was kind of our motto, always be ready to give an accounting of the hope that is in you. In order to be able to do that to everyone, you need to be able to start at the beginning, assuming nothing, giving a case, an account of why, rationally, you can be religious as you are. Why that is rational and not some blind leap of faith, something silly, something delusional. Why it is eminently rational that you do so. Not only rational, of course we're going to talk about the grace of faith, but it is very rational that you believe. One of the things that's thrown around is that religious people have kind of abandoned their reason, or insofar as they're worshiping God or reading the Bible, at those moments they kind of leave reason aside. We never ever claim that as Catholics, and so that's why apologetics is important, to establish the rational criteria for your belief. Now, the Gospels are distinct from other historical documents because they are really kind of rife with miraculous events. So at one time they claim to be historical documents, but also are filled with miracles that seem to be, at least in the popular mind, more part of mythologies or stories or fiction and things like this. So you have these notable documents that have been held in such reverence that claim to be historical documents, but are full of things that are seemingly fanciful, things that don't happen usually in historical events. That's why we look to the Gospels, another reason why we look to the Gospels as that possible historical witness to God's revelation in history. Because if God were to reveal himself, we would imagine that that would be accompanied by miraculous events. Confirmation of God's teaching by miracles. You can have any person you want come up and say, God sent me, and this is what I think you need to do for salvation. This is what God told me to tell you to do for your salvation. We would be ridiculous if we believed someone just because they said so. It's confirmed by something notable. What proof could you give me that I ought to listen to you and to sacrifice this or that and to do this or that or to go with you or to leave this behind if you give me nothing beyond your own word to make this radical change of life? Okay? We would expect that if God were to reveal himself, something outside of the ordinary would happen as confirmation. That's a miracle. Something that happens outside of the natural order of creation something that happens outside of the natural processes of nature, to show a confirmation of what's being said and taught by a divine legate or divine messenger. In fact, St. Francis de Sales, in his works called the Catholic Controversies, when he was opposing Calvinism, that's one of the points he made. He said, none of the reformers can point to any criterion of their being sent on a mission from God to reform or change anything. No one can point to eminent holiness, no miraculous mission from God, nothing like that. Nothing like the apostles did. The reason why the apostles and Christ himself were credible is precisely because of miraculous confirmation of their teaching. Whenever anyone demands a radical change like that, especially if it's a claim coming from God, then you would expect there would be something to confirm that claim. Miracles. This is, of course, one of the miracles of Christ depicted, one of the many depicted in art. So, lots of objections to miracles. This one is the most common. Not necessarily that people would say miracles are impossible, but it's an implicit assumption of many people that the Gospels can't be historical precisely because they record miracles, and we all know that miracles can't happen. Therefore, it can't be historical. That's why, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Smith, but a lot of scriptural scholars, not a lot, but a minority of scriptural scholars, at least years ago, would claim that any portion of the Gospels that talks about the fall of the temple couldn't actually be prophecy. It was written after the fact because they mentioned it. They couldn't have prophesied about it because prophecy was impossible. Therefore, they wrote it after the fact. So they would date some of the Gospels to after 70 AD because it talked about the fall of the temple in 70 AD, which happened in 70 AD, and they couldn't have prophesied about it. That's an assumption that people come to Scripture with, that miracles can't happen, and if you see miracles recorded, then it must be not historical, or it must be embellished because miracles can't happen. That's one of the biggest obstacles to the Gospels, is people just think, for no reason, they just think miracles can't happen, therefore these aren't true. Okay? But as we see, the response to this is begging the question. If you establish reliable historical testimony, unquestioned historical testimony, supported by many, many witnesses, that say miracles did happen here, then you would be bound just intellectually to say, well, I suppose they did. I would have no reason to doubt this overwhelming human testimony that they did. So it's begging the question, saying this can't be historical because miracles happened. What we're saying is we're going to establish these as credible historical documents, and seeing that they record miracles, we are bound to believe that miracles did in fact happen. Okay? So that's one obstacle, one objection to the miracles. Miracles are opposed to science. Okay, that's a stupid sentence anyway. It doesn't really make sense that miracles are opposed to science. But what is usually meant by that is miracles, because they are outside of the natural order of things, the laws of nature we see, they can't happen, and therefore they're opposed to creation or to science or to the laws of nature. Of course, they're outside of the ordinary. That's the point. It's a direct intervention of God in the created order. That's how a miracle is defined. It doesn't get rid of the laws of nature, make them null and void. It simply acts outside of them. Okay, so it's really no objection to miracles to say that they happen outside the norm. That's exactly the point. Okay? God intervening in creation, in history, in nature, does something notably different than the normal process of things as we see them in day-to-day life. But that presents no obstacle to say that they can't happen, simply because it would be out of the ordinary. That's how they're defined, after all. Actually, one little example here taken from one of these books is, in a way, you can have a violation of the natural order of things simply by opposing gravity by an upward lift. I mean, where do you say that something goes outside of the order or contradicts the order of nature? With a miracle, it happens outside of the natural order of things, but that is no reason to say it can't happen. Objection to miracle number 3. Why can't miracles be attributed to the devil as easily as to God? This is a good one. This is probably the most compelling at first glance when we hear it first. But think about this. Of course, we believe in the existence of evil spirits, of the devil, and of his fallen angels, and could certainly work apparent wonders. We see, for example, the story of Moses kind of battling with these wondrous signs with the Egyptian miracle workers there, the priests. We can see that that can happen, that there can be an appearance of wonders that come not just from our Lord and his glorious angels, but also from the devil and his fallen angels. But this is why, by the way, the church, in considering something like the supposed apparitions at Medjugorje, does not make a claim about their miraculous nature as coming from God until the effects can be seen in the long term. Sometimes that's the only way you can determine whether something was from God or not. Something can be apparently good. St. Paul said that the devil can appear to be an angel of light, okay, to us. But the prudence and the patience and the long-lasting perseverance of the church has shown to be very, very wise and guided by the Holy Spirit over the history of the church, because she takes a long time to make a decision on some of these things. Like, is this from God? I don't know yet. What are the fruits of this supposed miracle? Closer to God? Are people closer to God? Are there vocations? Is there an increase in recourse to the sacraments? Is there an increased prayer life in those who were involved? Or is it the opposite? Okay, so you can see by the long-term effects or by the fruits of a particular event whether or not it seems to come from God. Other things as well. Its superficiality. Is it merely like a flash bang kind of thing that has no apparent good for anyone's soul at all? You can see that when the fascination with movies about exorcisms and things like this. In fact, mentioning exorcisms immediately grabs attention for people because it's like notable, interesting, weird things happening. Okay, that's another way we can tell, is it from God or is it not? What good did it have on a soul? Did it have any good, or was it just a wonder, a sign of notable weirdness that just happened to attract attention? Also, the baseness of the miracle worker, the supposed miracle worker, or the frivolous nature of the circumstances. Does the situation seem worthy of God? Does it seem worthy of a wonder worked by God? Or is it base and superficial and have no apparent good effects? Okay? So these are not sure signs. That's why we don't decide this on our own, but it takes the judgment of the church over a long period of time. I've said this before. That's why it's providential that the church, the center of the church, is in Rome, because they work slowly anyway, and so it works really nicely together. I can make fun of Italians, okay?
Actually, a comment. This last opposition objection.
Yep.
Isn't it very simple, though, because if you recognize that there is a devil, there must be God.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. So if you were to admit that something could happen by the work of the devil, you're already, by that very fact, admitting that the supernatural world exists. Yeah, you should have mentioned that earlier. I wouldn't have to give all that explanation. Yeah. Well, this is awkward, isn't it? Okay. Okay. So I think this is the last one. If there's an easier way to do this, stop me before I explain it. We don't yet know everything that nature can do. Absolutely true. There's new scientific discoveries every day. No problem with that. But we do know for certain things that nature cannot do, absolutely speaking. Obviously, these examples are related to what happens in the Gospels. For example, such as spontaneously heal or build tissue in an instant, or raise a man from the dead, or blindness, or sight rather being instantly restored. Okay? Nature doesn't do that. And no matter what advances we find as we study nature, we know now for certain that nature does not act in that way. Okay? So to explain away miracles by saying, well, it's something nature probably can do that we haven't discovered yet. Yeah, I highly doubt that all the miracles worked by Christ, instant curing from paralysis from birth, or blindness from birth, or the spontaneous creation of tissue, things like this, that does not happen in nature, and we know that to be true. So we can allow for all kinds of wonders that have yet to be discovered in nature, but we already know with certainty, no matter what those discoveries are, that nature cannot do some things that are in fact recorded in the Gospels. Okay, so I could have just started by saying this. Trust me, the objections are lame. Okay, some of them lamer than others. They have weight. They carry weight for people. I say this kind of sarcastically and to be humorous, because some people do really deeply find an objection to the Gospels based on trouble with miracles. Like, I don't think that can happen. And so I'm not saying that everyone's just malicious and has bad will and is hard-headed, but what I'm saying is none of them hold water when investigated, even for a few moments. Okay, that's just kind of groundwork to say, Miracles are one of the main reasons we look at the Gospels and are curious about their historicity, because they claim to be historical and yet there's miracles. So as long as we put away any what we call a priori objections to miracles, ideological presuppositions against miracles, as long as we can get rid of those, then we're in a more suitable state of mind to assess the historical nature of the Gospels, because we're not troubled by the mere fact that miracles exist in the written documents. We're okay with that. We're at least able to allow for their existence. That's that intro is for, to allow at least for the existence of miracles in the mind of someone who might be skeptical. Say, listen, none of your objections are conclusive against miracles, so given the overwhelming testimony that we're going to see here in a moment, at least leave your mind open to the possibility of miracles. Because once you see the weight of the historical testimony, perhaps you will be swayed that, yes, miracles must be true, and they must have happened as reported by the credible witnesses who are the evangelists. So, to say whether or not the Gospels are historical, reliable historical documents, there are certain criteria that are used, not just by scriptural scholars, but by historians in general, textual scholars of many kinds, tools by which they assess the worth of a document. Whether or not it is substantially the same as the original document, whether it's trustworthy, whether it can actually be attributed to the one who traditionally is said to have authored that book. Okay, so authenticity first. Is it really by the person to whom it is attributed? Okay, the Gospels in our case, are those four documents really by, respectively, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? That's what this criterion of authenticity seeks to analyze. Is it true that Matthew, an apostle, wrote this book? It's important to get that clear, because if it's true that this historical person that was a companion of Christ wrote the book, then it gives immediate weight to what is said, right? So you want to assess, is the author the one who it traditionally is thought to be? You can assess this by two different routes. Actually, both routes go together. So external evidence to whether or not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote their respective Gospels. Okay. We have both Christian and non-Christian writers of the first 2 centuries show that it was very widely spread, held in great reverence, precisely because it was written by those four. Okay? It was already known to have been written by those four and held in great reverence because of that fact, both by Christian writers and non-Christian writers of the very early centuries, the 1st and 2nd centuries. Okay? Early testimony to the high regard in which these documents were held because of their authors. It's hard to get that wrong so quickly, to say that this was written by Matthew, but in fact somewhere down the line, after only like 20 years, we lost the actual author. No, especially in a culture which was oral in its testimony more than written. Okay? Their memories, their minds were much better than ours in that regard. That things were passed down orally very accurately, okay, and traditions were held very accurately. It was clear also from these writers that the Gospels were in widespread practical use among the Christian communities, that they were seen as the memoirs of the apostles. In fact, if you look at St. Justin Martyr's account of the Mass in the mid-2nd century, and he lays out the structure of the Mass, and he says there's basically what we call the liturgy of the Word. He says the memoirs of the apostles are read publicly as long as time permits. So not only were they known to be authored by the apostles, but they were also held to be used in liturgical worship because they were the memoirs of the apostles, the accounts of the apostles' life with Christ. Okay. Would the apostles, this is kind of a question that you'd ask yourself to establish the probability that it was in fact written by the ones, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who we believe it's written by. Would the apostles and their followers who gave their lives to spread the Word of God allow a series of forgeries to spread and taken as the inspired truth of Christ? Okay, much was given by the apostles in order to spread the gospel, and their disciples, many of the early Christians were martyrs, right? Would that be risked if there was any doubt whatsoever that what they had for the Gospels, if there's any doubt about whether or not that was written by the credible historical witnesses, the companions of Christ himself? Would Jewish converts have easily been swayed into accepting forged books as on the same level as the books of the Old Testament? Definitely not. Definitely not, unless there was real established certainty about who the authors of these books were. Would learned pagans have undertaken a severe and sacrificial lifestyle on so little evidence? No. Would people change their lives drastically in terms of their moral life, their convictions, based on something that was only weakly supported by a tradition that, yeah, there were some followers of this guy and we think they wrote these? No. To change your life, to leave everything behind, that would require very strong evidence, very strong concrete reasons to believe that these were authored by the companions of Christ himself. Okay? And would the enemies of the church have neglected, this is a very powerful argument, would the enemies of the church have neglected such an obvious argument against the new Christian religion, namely the forgery of its books? It was never a claim, at least not to my knowledge, not in the knowledge of any scholar I've ever read, any father of the church I've ever read, any ancient historian I've ever read, that anyone ever called the Gospels into question on this point, that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Our modern kind of condescending attitude only has begun to do that. I'm sure Mr. Smith could tell you about that, that scriptural scholars nowadays have such a disgustingly condescending attitude towards ancient writers and the fathers of the church that they think they would be ignorant of things like this. And that only now can we see who they were really written by. Give me a break. Come on. Here's a great quote from St. Irenaeus from 180. St. Irenaeus, by the way, was a disciple of St. Polycarp, who was himself a disciple of John the Apostle, the beloved disciple. So Polycarp recounts to Irenaeus, and Irenaeus even tells us this, Polycarp recounts to Irenaeus that he remembers hearing the truth of the gospel coming from the lips of John himself. Okay? So we're two people removed from one of the apostles. Let's think about how unlikely it would be that St. Irenaeus would get this wrong. Here's a quote. Matthew wrote a gospel for the Jews in their own language, while Peter and Paul were preaching and establishing the church at Rome. If you ever need a confirmation that Peter and Paul were the princes of the apostles and died in Rome, there you have that. After their departure, Mark also, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, handed down to us in writing the information which Peter had given. And Luke, the follower of Paul, wrote out the gospel which Paul used to preach. Later, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had reclined on his breast, published his gospel during his sojourn at Ephesus in Asia Minor. We have someone who was taught by a disciple of one of the apostles, telling us very clearly the order in which and the people who wrote the gospels. Okay? There's tons of quotes like this from the fathers, but this is one of the clearer ones and kind of sums it all up. There can be little doubt, if any, that the gospels were written by the men Matthew and John, who were actual apostles, and Mark and Luke, who were followers of two of the original apostles. Okay. So there are many other writings, fathers of the church, pagan historians, etc., that support the same things we're saying now. We're using very selective quotes. They're work of the men who were followers of Christ, and they were intended to record actual historical events. You saw in that quote of Irenaeus that these are not stories written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they recorded the life of Christ. They intended to record the life of Christ accurately and authentically. There is not one of the pagan classics that is supported in so strong a fashion. We'll get to that point a little later on. It relates to the diagram, the little table, the chart you have in front of you. There is not one of the pagan classic works that is supported by such strong external evidence as the Gospels are. Here's one little example. No one doubts that the Gallic Wars was authored by Julius Caesar, but the only ancient references we have that this is so are found in the works of two men, Plutarch and Suetonius. Okay, two historians after the fact. That compared to the historical evidence, external historical evidence we have of the authenticity of the Gospels is just so lopsided it's not even funny. Now, internal evidence. Things within the writings themselves that point to the fact that, yes, these were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Examination of the texts themselves shows that the authors were, in fact, Jews and contemporaries of the events they record. So they were not written after the fact, long after the fact, I should say. They were contemporaries of the events they describe, and they were, in fact, Jewish men. Okay, these are not foreign people coming up with stories. That they were Jews is shown by the fact that they wrote in Koine Greek, but with traces of Hebrew idiom seen in the works of Philo and Flavius Josephus. So, Greek with Hebrew idiom is also seen in other non-Christian sources that were written by Hebrews who were writing in Greek. Okay, so that style was known in other works. We see that in the works of some of the gospel writers, that they wrote in Greek but had Hebrew idioms, meaning they were familiar with Hebrew and it came out in their writing of Greek. Okay, the way they said things, wrote things, had a Hebrew flavor to it, we could say. Okay. Also, the writers show no familiarity with Greek literature or philosophy. I'd say with the exception of maybe John the Apostle. Show no familiarity with Greek literature or philosophy, while they are intimately familiar with the religious customs of Judaism. Like in and out, they know the details of the Jewish religion, which is not easy to have so expert a grasp on unless you are, in fact, one who has lived it. Okay? So that is seen in their description of events, description of the various feasts that are in the Gospels. Okay? Modern scholars have failed to find any errors with regard to topography or political and religious landscape of Palestine at the time of Christ. Every little detail that is described by the Gospel writers is accurate as far as history can tell. There have been no errors in terms of the layout of the land or the events or the characters, historical characters that would have been around then, or other, the milieu of the place, of the time, is all completely accurate. Yes?
The Gospel writers describe, because one of the chief objections I hear is that, with perhaps the exception of Paul, the others were illiterate. They couldn't write it.
There would really be no obstacle to the fact that it would still be authored by them if that were the case. I'm not really sure if a solid case could be made that they were in fact illiterate. If that were the claim, that wouldn't really pose an obstacle to the fact of the authenticity of the books of the Gospels, because books can be translated and still maintain their authenticity. They can be copied, they can be transcribed while maintaining their authenticity. But I know of no strong evidence that all of the Gospel writers or any of the Gospel writers were necessarily illiterate. Is there any that you know, Mr. Smith? Yeah. Yeah.
But it's also not uncommon to have amanuensis. You hold it as it's opposite of illiterate. Churches can roll it.
Right. Yeah. So one could, so a document is still attributed to, in fact, customarily was still attributed to the one from whom it came, even if an intervening scribe was used. But that's a good question. Okay, so there's no errors in terms of topography, the political players, political events, the details of the Jewish religion, etc. Recent archaeology has, in fact, done nothing but confirm some of the events and characters and places described in the Gospels. For example, the house of Peter, the pool of 5 porticos, the synagogue of Capernaum, the inscription of Pontius Pilate, and the tomb of Caiaphas. The detail and vividness of the account speaks in favor of a personal witness. So the manner in which the evangelist described events itself confirms that they were personal witnesses of the events. Okay, the way it was described, the vividness of it, it's not some kind of cold, robotic description of general events, but they're a very detailed description of emotion, of sounds and sights and things like this. So that itself is a pretty solid confirmation that this was written by people who saw, or at least heard firsthand from other people who saw what happened. Yes?
I read somewhere that one of the events in the Bible that the author thought did not happen was, I don't remember what it was called, but when Jesus was born,
Mm-hmm.
it said that Herod at the time decided to kill all male newborn,
Mm-hmm.
and the author contends that this could not have happened without it being mentioned anywhere else. That it is such a big event
Right.
to kill all the male newborns there. So that was one of the examples of something in the Bible not being actually factual.
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, that wouldn't have been particularly notable, I would say, at the time. Secondly, the image we have of the slaughter of the holy innocents is shown to be, at least according to my knowledge, shown to be much larger than what actually would have happened. Like the loss of life would have been minimal, at least in comparison to usually like pictures we think of the holy innocents, just like thousands and thousands of babies being slaughtered. So it was a horrible thing. Wouldn't necessarily have been totally notable and outside of the ordinary for something like that to happen, a political act by which a massive slaughter happened. You wouldn't expect necessarily to find that in like every notable historical source. But it also is probably not as on big a scale as we imagine. So it wouldn't have been necessarily notable on a huge historical or political scale if it wasn't that big of a loss of life. So based on what he's actually using as a sources, I would say I think he's mistaken that it would be something you'd expect to find described in other historical sources, just because maybe with our modern sensibilities, although, well, no, I would say with our modern sensibilities, we still ignore stuff like that pretty clearly. But probably it wasn't as big as usually we think of it, and it wouldn't have been outside of the ordinary on such a large scale that we would think. But a lot of people that try and call into question historical events in the Gospels use really outdated scholarship that's usually ideologically driven instead of historically sound. Usually it's more pop works than scholarly historical works that do thorough research and exhaustive research on many different sources of that time period and stuff. So my guess is, and you see this on like History Channel and A&E when they're talking about the Bible, like, did you know that actually Mary's body was found just a few years ago? It's like, it's not. It's silly. So I'm guessing what you read is something like that, where someone said, it seems unlikely that we wouldn't find this elsewhere, therefore it couldn't have happened. It's kind of weak.
That would have happened maybe in a county instead of nationwide?
Yeah, more like that, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
More like a village.
Right, yeah. A much smaller scale than we'd think usually. Artwork depicting the slaughter of the holy innocents is now it's still horrible, but it's painted as just, like I said, hundreds or thousands of children being slaughtered, whereas it probably is more something like on the scale of a village or a small city, which you wouldn't necessarily expect to make the news on a widespread historical scale. Yeah. Yes.
Paul Meyer, who just retired, professor of Asian history at Western, did an actuary study of the city at the time where the slaughter of the innocents was based, and based on his studies, he said it was probably less than 10.
Less than 10.
Less than 10. And keep in mind that Herod at the time was horribly ill, was very sick, and possibly going insane, and he's illness, and so they're not going to record that anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point too. So you wouldn't want to make the leader look bad there anyway. So less than 10, that's interesting. So on a really small scale, at least compared to what we would usually imagine. So thank you. Okay, moving along. Trustworthiness. Did the authors, so this asks the question, did the authors know what they were talking about? And did they have reason to deceive? So, okay, let's say it was written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Did those authors know what they were talking about? And did they have reason to deceive us? So if they wrote it, would they have lied? Could we find a motivation that they lied? Okay, that's an important question to ask too. Because even if it's written by someone that, in fact, we traditionally expected to write it, we still need to look at the trustworthiness of their account. They certainly knew the facts. Okay, Matthew and John, as we said, were personal companions, and Mark and Luke were personal companions of the apostles. So they had the ability to know very clearly, very vividly, and firsthand all of the events narrated in the Gospels. There is no evidence of deception, nor is there a discernible motive for it. They suffered persecution and death for their preaching and had nothing to gain. There were other contemporaries of these events. So if they were untruthful, others would have contradicted their account. Okay, so there were other people alive at the same time who witnessed the same events that the apostles did. If they had been telling fibs, there would have been large opposition, massive opposition to their spreading the gospel based on the truth of what they said. Now there was opposition to their spreading the gospel, but it wasn't because they claimed that they thought it was untrue that Jesus did and said these things. It was precisely because they themselves also knew that Jesus did and said these things that they wanted to keep it quiet. That's why they persecuted the apostles. But no one ever called into question the veracity, or at least their honesty, in narrating the accounts of the Gospels. Okay, apparent inconsistencies. This is an interesting criterion that textual scholars use to establish historicity of an account, or accuracy of a historical account. Are there apparent inconsistencies? So you have 4 different accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of more or less the substantially same historical events. And they tell them in different ways, and sometimes there are apparent inconsistencies. Scholars here use that as a positive indication that they are authentic historical documents. If this were a coordinated event aimed at deception, do you not think they would have coordinated their stories a bit better to make it more plausible? Okay, these apparent inconsistencies, which, by the way, all of them, however severe a contradiction seems, there's never been a contradiction in the accounts of the gospel writers that cannot be resolved in a very reasonable way. Okay? But these apparent inconsistencies actually confirm further the veracity of the account in its substance. And further, the character of Christ, this is kind of a simple one, but I think compelling. The character of Christ could not have been invented. Okay? No character of the level of Christ in terms of his moral excellence, his kind of mystical character, his compelling truth has ever been invented, and probably could not be invented especially by people that were, in some cases, simple, not able to think like that or deceive like that or think of someone so excellent as Christ. Of the three criteria that we mentioned that are used by scholars to determine whether or not a text is to be accepted as historically accurate, integrity. The question we ask when we're looking at this is, the text as we have it now, in the version we have it now, is it substantially the same as the original? That's very important to determine as well. Why? Because if the Bible as we have it now, or the Gospels specifically as we have them now, are way different and have accrued all these details and stories over the centuries that weren't in the original, then they lose all of their worth. Because we want to know what was actually written, penned by the apostles themselves, not what was added on later or anything like that. So we want to ask, when you open up a gospel nowadays, you open up the Gospel of Matthew in a modern printed book that is the Bible, is what you're reading the same substantially as what Matthew himself wrote? Same on for Mark, Luke, and John. That's what integrity means. Is it an integral text? Is it as it was written by the original authors themselves? Okay, so here are some reasons to believe, yes, in fact, this is integral as it was written. Again, the great reverence in which these texts were held from the very beginning would not allow for them to be changed very easily at all. Okay? If these were held in public worship in such high regard, and they were held as divinely inspired very early on, it is very unlikely that they would ever be allowed to be manipulated or corrupted or distorted or added on to. That's one very strong piece of evidence, because they were used in liturgical worship. And as they were read in liturgical worship, people, again, the culture especially in which these were written and passed on, was very much about oral testimony and tradition. So being heard in worship, everyone would have become intimately familiar with the text, and thus been familiar with the text enough to know if anyone were to change it on their own. Okay? Nowadays, we have the text available to us at snap of a finger, but we're not familiar enough with Scripture to know if someone read a verse out of the Gospel of Matthew and changed a word on their own. We probably wouldn't notice in most cases. Well, they would have definitely noticed. And in fact, I think I put it on here. Maybe it's on the next slide, a story about St. Jerome. But anyway, they were widely diffused among Christian communities, so they were well known not just in one place, but everywhere the Christian church was growing up. And there is substantial uniformity of the text in all the manuscripts that we have, some of which are from the 4th century. Okay, so entire manuscripts from the 4th century. We have fragments of those books as well from earlier on. So we have almost a line we can draw from now until parts of very, very early manuscripts of the Gospels, and we can compare how much substantial unity and uniformity is there between what we have now and the parts of text we have from the 1st century or the 2nd century, and how much uniformity is there between what we have now and like whole manuscripts we have from the 3rd century, from the 4th century, and you'll find that it's very, very, very strong. Okay. Oh, here's about Jerome in a second. The memories of the ancients, as I've been saying, were incomparably better than ours. Without many written documents, their minds were trained to accurately store large amounts of information and with great accuracy. Example, St. Jerome caused quite a tumult when, in his translation of the book of Jonah, he used a non-traditional word. That is, he translated a particular word differently than it had been in the past, and it caused quite a stir, not just among like other scholars, but among the Christian faithful. Okay, that's how intimately the text was known, not because they were reading it all the time, or they had it in front of them, because they did not, but because they heard it, they knew it, it was passed on, and they were able to do that with great accuracy. So existing manuscripts. You have a picture here of, which I believe is the oldest, the Codex Sinaiticus, mid-4th century, contains the entire New Testament. So it's the oldest entire manuscript of the New Testament. We have fragments from earlier than this. The oldest entire manuscript is from New Testament, or from this codex here that's pictured here. And then the Codex Vaticanus, mid-4th century, has all the Gospels and most of the New Testament writings. The Codex Alexandrinus, early 5th century, contains almost the entire New Testament. And the complete copies of books in these codices correspond with even earlier portions of the same books. So if we compare these manuscripts with earlier portions of the same books, we find that there is really strong uniformity. And that leads us logically to believe that in the rest of the text as well, those parts that are missing in the early fragments, we can expect the same uniformity. Since a random fragment I have here of this book matches, I am led to believe that that would be the case for the rest of it as well. And there are many, many fragments we have too. Another one that I didn't put up here is a piece of evidence for the integrity of the Gospels is that all the quotes of the early fathers of the church, some people say, and I don't know if anyone's ever done this, but the fathers of the church quote Scripture so often that if we just looked at the works of the fathers of the church, we could piece together most of the Gospels, if not all of the Gospels, just from their works. And some of the fathers of the church are late 1st century, early 2nd century. So also based on that evidence, not just actual manuscripts of the Gospels themselves, but also by external quoting of the Gospels in the fathers of the church, shows that there's uniformity between their quotes and the manuscripts that we do have. Therefore, we have really no strong doubt, no strong reason to believe that there would be any inconsistency or corruption for all of these reasons.
Father?
Yes?
So what language is that?
This would be Greek. So the manuscripts, New Testament was written in Greek. So if we're talking about only the New Testament now, we would be talking in all these manuscripts about Greek text. Okay? Did you read Greek for everyone over the break?
Only a chosen.
Okay, only a chosen few. I think this is too blurry to even be able to read. So, okay. We do not have original manuscripts, that is the actual text penned by the apostles. Okay, we do not have those. That should be pretty obvious. If we did, that'd be a pretty big deal. But what we do have is more than sufficient, more than satisfactory, especially in terms of normal textual scholarship and historical study, to say that what we do have, as early, as far back as it goes, 100%, maybe not 100%, but 99% ensures that this is the same as was in the original, same as in the manuscript. You'll look at the little chart I gave you. Now here we have a chart of other ancient manuscripts, non-Christian sources, of course. These are all pagan sources. And we have the author in the left column, the work in the next column, the date in which it was written, and then the date of the earliest complete copy that we have. Okay? The next column after that is the time span between when it was written and that earliest copy we have. Okay? So how much time there was possible for corruption of the text. Now all of these works are not questioned in the least that they were in fact written by Horace or Cicero or Caesar or Plato or Thucydides or whatever. No one questions that they were penned by these men, and that the work we have now, if I go to Barnes & Noble and I pick up a work of Thucydides, no one questions that what I'm reading is as Thucydides wrote it. Okay, and with good reason. There's good evidence that it's substantially the same and integral as how he wrote it. So what I'm saying is, in all these historical works, we don't think twice about accepting them as historically accurate, written by those people, and integrally the same, substantially the same, as when it was originally written by these people, even though we don't have the original manuscripts. So let's look at the earliest complete copy column here. So you got 9th century, but it was written in 35 BC. This is the Horace row right here. Written in 35 BC, the earliest complete copy we have is in the 9th century AD. It's a span of 850 years. Okay? And then number of early manuscripts, complete or partial manuscripts, we have 17. Looking at Cicero, you have 900 years of a time span between when it was written and the earliest complete copy. We have 16 manuscripts, either partial or complete. Actually, I have this up here. Caesar, the Gallic Wars, I already mentioned, 950 years between when it was written and the copy that we have. 11 manuscripts of it. Plato, the Republic, you get the idea. 1,300 years. 1,300 years for Thucydides, his Peloponnesian War, when it was written and when we have a copy of it. Aristotle's Poetics, 1,300 years span between when he wrote it, when we have the first copy. Herodotus, his history, same thing. Look at the very bottom. The Gospels, written between 40 and 90 AD. Earliest complete copy, 4th century, a span of 350 years. How many manuscripts do we have? 263 before the 9th century. Okay? Overwhelmingly strong evidence, more than any of these other historical texts, or these texts that were historically known to have been written by these people and integrally passed down in substance. Okay? If you look at this and compare this to the Scriptures, the New Testament, it's not even close. If we were to hold that these were all substantially the same then as they are now, and we are totally rational and justified in doing so, then how much more should we be confident that what I read in the Gospels is the same as when it came from the pen or the quill or whatever it was of the evangelists? Okay? We have no reason to doubt, just on rational grounds, just on historical grounds, just on grounds of scholarship, textual scholarship. There's no reason, not even the faintest reason, to doubt that this was penned and kept in its integrity up until now. It was penned by the apostles and kept integral to now. Okay? That makes sense. It's helpful to have these statistics because it kind of puts everything in perspective. It is so unreasonable to doubt the historicity and the integrity of the Gospels. It's very irrational to do so if you do the study, if you do the thorough research. Because if I hold these are true, and these are integral, and I can read now what was written then of course I can do so with the Gospels. Even more so, not just based on the manuscripts and the short time span, but also the reverence in which these texts were held. Change would not have been easily allowed, as I said. The other texts, we could question that. Maybe someone had motive and no one really cared if you changed slightly one of the dialogues of Plato, or if you changed one of the biographies or the histories written by Thucydides. We have no strong reason to doubt why someone would do that or question whether or not someone had the motive to do that. Maybe they did. Maybe it happened. But with the Gospels, we have many, many reasons to believe that could never have happened. And we have an earlier witness to the Gospels, and in fact the rest of the New Testament books, than any other ancient, pagan, historically accepted source. Okay, so that's a quick overview of those three criteria. So what does this all mean? So by all historical and textual standards, the Gospels are trustworthy and substantially accurate historical witnesses to real historical events. By now, we should be totally comfortable in looking at the Gospels as history, without corruption, without embellishment, without any kind of decoration added later for religious purposes. Okay, that is something that's raised often, that these were just embellished for religious ends or for religious ideologies, that they added to Christ's sayings, his simple, kind sayings. They added to it all these miracles and then all these commands for religious purposes. There's no possibility of that happening by all historical standards. There's no possibility of that happening. What we have here in the four Gospels is history, plain and simple. History, unfortunately for some, that contains miracles, and miracles that we're now compelled to accept if we accept any other historical testimony. If we were to doubt the historicity of the Gospels, we would have to call into doubt many other historical documents that we hold without any hesitation. That's what I just said. Then why are the Gospels doubted? A lot of the things about miracles I said in the beginning. Two main reasons, though, that I picked out. An a priori ideological decision that miracles are impossible. A priori meaning something I bring with me to the table. I don't assess the evidence and then make the decision then. I bring my decision with me. That's what a priori means. It means before the fact, I make an ideological decision that miracles are impossible. I don't look at the evidence, the historical evidence, and say, maybe miracles are possible because this historical testimony is honest and I have no reason to doubt it. Therefore, miracles did happen. They don't think about it that way. They bring with them this doubt that can't be shaken, that miracles cannot happen. That's why the Gospels, even though there's such overwhelming historical evidence that they are true history, they simply set it aside because of the miracle part. And secondly, maybe a bit more of a guess, because you can't read people's hearts, but There is a resistance to the life-changing realities present in the Gospels. If one admits that the Gospels are true, he or she must change their way of life drastically. So if I were to admit everything that is said here in the Gospels is historically true, that God said this and demands this of me for my salvation, then if I hold that to be true, then I got to do a lot of things differently. I need to leave a lot of things behind. And we don't want to encounter something like that. We don't want to encounter that decision or make that decision. So it's easier sometimes just to set it aside and make up all these excuses that they're just fanciful illusions that someone made up for religious purposes, which we know isn't true. So now what? We know that God exists. We know that He revealed Himself in history. And we have accurate testimony as to what He said and did, and that He claimed to be God and confirmed it by miracles. That's pretty big. So, many of you have heard maybe this trilemma. Based on the fact that in the Gospels we see historical testimony, and we see clearly that Christ claimed divinity in a number of different places. So, Christ implicitly or indirectly, and also explicitly and directly in many places in the Gospels, claimed to be God. Okay. Now, what do you do with that claim, given the fact that you now know this is history, and that it's an accurate testimony as to what He actually said and did? What do you do with that, knowing that He claimed to be God very clearly in the testimony of all four of the evangelists, and in the testimony of the other New Testament writers? There's three options. That He was the Lord, that He was a liar, or that He was a lunatic. Okay? Those are the only three options, really. That He was crazy and believed Himself to be God, but wasn't. That He was a liar and deceived everyone, trying to make them think He was God, but He wasn't. Or that He was, in fact, God, the Lord. Those are the three options. So, liar. Let's say that first. So, option one, that He was a liar. This is admitted by no one. Even those who are opposed to the Christian religion altogether, those who don't even believe in God, they all swoon over Christ's moral excellence and the greatness of His teaching. He was this wise rabbi and so humble and was doing good, going around doing good. They deny His divinity, but they say, no, He was honest, He was truthful, He had moral excellence. There was no moral character in all of history or literature as great as Christ. Okay? It would be impossible to claim from the historical evidence that we have in the Gospels that He was a liar. It would be impossible for you to make that case. Even those who were non-theists, those who don't believe in God, all talk about the one thing they want to say good about Jesus is that He was morally upright and a great moral teacher. Yes?
But just following that logic for a second, if He said He was the Son of God, so if they don't believe in His divinity, then thereby He have
Yeah, well, that's the inconsistency in their position, exactly. And you're right to find that inconsistency. Because if they say He was a moral teacher and had great moral excellence, they usually don't claim that He even claimed to be God. They'll say either that was an embellishment added later, or that it's been misinterpreted and He didn't actually claim that. It was something else. But that's exactly right, though. That's exactly the inconsistency there, is if they did say He was morally excellent, then they have to find some way to explain away His claims to be God. Either they were add-ons later by later communities, or that He didn't in fact say that. But very good point. Lunatic. Second option is that He was a lunatic, that He was crazy, that He believed He was God, but He really wasn't. Okay, first of all, that does not explain the miracles recounted in the Gospels. The fact that Christ would have been delusional would not explain the historical occurrences of actual miracles. But also, along the same logic as the last one, everyone extols the greatness of Christ, His serenity, His intelligence, His kind of almost like mystical greatness. I just pressed a button. I hope it didn't do anything. Oh, I locked it. Okay. His greatness, that He was far and above everyone else in His intelligence, His apparent omniscience, all these things. It would be just as difficult to make the case that He was crazy as it would be to make the case that He was a liar. Okay, there's just simply no evidence to support that. The only reason it's an option is because of the desire to avoid the third option, which is that He was in fact the Lord, who He said He was, what He confirmed by miracles. He confirmed His teaching and His claim by miracles, and the greatest of all miracles, the fact that He rose from the dead. Okay? This is the only logical conclusion. As you pointed out, there's huge inconsistencies in the other two. Based on the historical evidence, based on the historical evidence. That's the only logical conclusion. If we're going to be rational about it, it's the only logical conclusion. Our reason is compelled to go this last route, this route of Christ as the Lord. He taught unparalleled doctrine, had unsurpassed moral character, performed many miracles, and most notably rose from the dead. I like this image of Christ. We had it in our home growing up, and it always like shamed me into being good. It was like, Christ was like, Amongst all the miracles of Christ, the resurrection is, maybe surprisingly to you, one that is established with relatively strong certainty even by non-Christian scholars. I mentioned to you that last time the scholar William Lane Craig, he's a philosopher, a Protestant philosopher, excellent in this apologetics realm. And his big area of specialty is historical evidence of the resurrection. And he says, now, as we have the evidence now, all reputable scholars, you have like pop scholars, those ones who try and sell books and make ridiculous claims and try and just deny things outright without any historical evidence. But he says all reputable scholars, both theists or atheists, both Christian and non-Christian, have established with overwhelming majority voice in the scholarly world that three things are historically certain and true. Okay? And then remember, these are Christians, non-Christians, theists, atheists. One, that Jesus was a real historical figure who was executed by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Okay? Pretty straightforward. That he was a real person in history at the time that he is depicted in the Gospels. Again, they are historical documents. Two, that his tomb was discovered to be empty. Historically certain. Okay? So many witnesses, okay, and such strong testimony that this is seen to be, by all scholars across the board, at least those who aren't just pop scholars trying to make an ideological point, by all those scholars of real good repute and who do thorough research in a scholarly way, this is certainly historically true that the tomb was found to be empty after he had been placed in it when dead. Third, that thousands of witnesses on separate occasions, both disciples and non-disciples, claim to see him risen and alive. This might surprise you that they say this is historically true. Now, the way they explain it might be different depending on whether or not they're Christian or non-Christian. They might say it was a mass delusion, which isn't tenable, by the way, logically or rationally in any way, not tenable. But they could claim this and still say, well, there's ways to say people claimed to see him, but didn't in fact. They were mistaken or they were delusional or whatever. But they all say it's historically certain that many people on various occasions in various places of both his inner circle, his disciples, and not his disciples, even his enemies, claimed to see him alive, okay, after he had been dead, claimed to see him risen in the flesh. Those three things are historically certain. Now the thing that Dr. William Lane Craig does is say, what is the most probable conclusion from these three things? There's a couple things you can say. I mentioned the mass delusion thing. It's simply not tenable because mass delusions or like mass hysteria happen in huge groups or with, if someone has a delusion because of a psychological problem, you can explain it in small cases, but in such widely varying cases and situations, it's not a legitimate or sufficient explanation, not satisfactory in the least. That 500 people over here or 1,000 people over here said this, and this small group saw him, and it agrees all around the board what everyone saw. You cannot make the case for mass delusion. People tried to make that case and still try to make that case for the miracle of the sun at Fatima in 1917 when 70,000 people saw the sun dancing in the sky. And so they'd say that's a mass delusion. Well, what they don't take into account is that hundreds of miles away, other people saw the same thing. And within that crowd of 70,000 people, I think I mentioned this in the Mary Talk last Advent, in that crowd of 70,000 people, there were people that were deeply inimical towards belief in God altogether. So the fact that they could be part of a mass delusion doesn't really make sense. Same thing true here. There are so many different instances, so well attested to, so solid historically, that it can't be doubted that many people claimed to be witnesses of the risen Christ. Both those who may have had motivation to, and those who did not have motivation to, but no one expected it. No one expected to see it. So that's another thing that explains away mass delusion, is that you like work yourself up to see what you deep down want to see. Okay, that was never an expectation, at least not consciously or immediately, of anyone, to see Christ right away, okay, risen from the dead. So now we have overwhelmingly credible evidence to move us to belief that Christ is real and is who he said he is. We also have accurate testimony of his teaching, which he said was necessary for our salvation. Okay? Now, this is the last step of the apologetic process, is Catholic apologetics. That is, based on that testimony we see in the Gospels that we just went over today, based on its historicity, its reliability, and based on the fact that the only explanation of that historical testimony about who Christ is that he is in fact God, risen from the dead, and what he said and taught and promised to us is reliable and credible because he is God. Then the next step is to look at the evidence as to what he said and did and cling to it because it is more certain than any other option. It is true. It must be true if we're going to go about it logically and rationally. It must be true that Christ, what he says and teaches in the Gospels, is in fact said and done for our salvation. And the promises can be really believed because they are said by God, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. So just from reason, starting from the existence of God, we now are at the point where we can look at the Gospels and say, that God whose existence we proved did reveal himself in history, according to all rational historical accounts. And we know that that person who is revealed in history is Jesus Christ, who is also God, claimed to be God, and proved it by miracles, most notably the miracle of the resurrection. He is God. He said and taught things for our salvation, and so we must cling to them for our salvation. That's the only place our reason can lead us. Now, it's important to remember here that we cannot impose the grace of faith on someone. You cannot prove to someone that they must change their life and follow Christ. Simply, you can't do that on your reason. What we can do, like I said the first time, is prepare someone's mind and their will and their heart to accept the grace of faith, because faith is a gift, can come only from God. You can't summon it up with your reason, but you can prepare yourself for, or someone else for faith, for that grace of faith that's given. That's why what we've done now, this is actually called technically preambles of the faith, preambula fidei, the preambles, those things you do before the grace of faith to prepare yourself to make that assent of the mind and the will strongly and solidly to cling to Christ. Yes?
I was going to say you have that same picture hanging up in your house.
Yeah, exactly. Good, you pay attention. Or maybe you're just staring at it when I talk in class and when you should be listening. No, just kidding. Yeah, this is a work of art by Raphael. It's Christ handing over the keys to Peter. The reason I put it there is because we move on now to Catholic Apologetics, which seeks to prove that Christ, through his words and his deeds historically written down in the Gospels, instituted one church for the salvation of all mankind, which is the Catholic Church. Okay? That's why we have Christ handing the keys to the kingdom of heaven to Peter, giving special authority to Peter to bind and to loose in heaven and on earth. And those keys to the kingdom of heaven, we say, reside in Peter's hands, and the power of the keys belongs to the successor of Peter, who is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who is the visible sign of unity of Christ's church here on earth. So that's the claim that we intend to establish the next time, the last time, so that once we're done with that, we will have started with nothing except simple phenomena in nature, using our reason, and finally coming to the fact that I must cling to the faith revealed by Christ and taught definitively and authoritatively in the Catholic Church, which he founded, and none other.